The man looked back. The holographic woman now wore a long robe reminiscent of ancient times. She looked very similar to Martyr and even sounded a lot like her. "So, you're one of Apollyon's goons," she said. "A sinner who roams around killing innocent folk and robbing them of their possessions." The woman tapped her foot as if impatient. "Is it that obvious?" the man said. "I'm sorry, I failed to introduce myself." She turned and gave an elegant bow. "I am called Book, the overseer's word to mankind." "Book," the man said. "What? Is your brain so much a whitewashed tomb as your soul?" "Yes, book. Bible is how it's translated in some languages. But Bible is a word that means book, so I figured it's less pretentious to just call myself Book." "Bible? I've heard of you. You're some sacred text. What's with all the man's voice trailed off. "What's with all the violent speech, immodesty, and general vulgarity? Yeah, a lot of people get the wrong idea about me. Most of me is history of some super evil people." "Well, the history of the world isn't as clean, pretty, or nice as people would like, and the road to the celestial station isn't a primrose path, so don't expect me to act like a princess." "Celestial station?" Conscience slapped the man across the cheek. "Would you stop that?" "Stop what?" the man said. "That! You've answered everything this woman has said with a question." "A question?" This time the man was smiling. "Hey, that one was on purpose," Conscience said. "No, it's fine," Book said. "Questioning me is good. Not enough people ask questions, good or otherwise. I can take it. Question me, analyze me, and debate me. Get angry, hate me, just don't ignore me. I'm strong enough to handle your objections and vitriol." "I have a question," Conscience said. Book looked at Conscience with amusement. "Your conscience is activated. That'll make things easier." "Why do you look like the lady this guy shot?" Conscience said. "What?" Book swelled, reaching the size of a small cat as she looked at the man.
What if you were stuck in a burdensome power armor and had to flee from the wrath to come? If this sounds familiar, it's because you know the classic story of Pilgrim's Progress. But this new version has giant mechs, plus robots, space marines, and talking platypuses. John Bunyan did not write those parts, but author David Umstattd did. Today, David enters the studio to share his new narrative podcast and upcoming novel, The Pilgrim's Progress Reloaded. Welcome back to Fantastical Truth, the podcast from Lorehaven.com, in which we explore fantastical stories for God's glory and apply their meaning to the real world. I'm E. Stephen Burnett, the publisher of Lorehaven, co-author of The Pop Culture Parent, and I also once wrote over 300 fake titles for a parody kids mystery series.
And I'm Zackary Russell, and walking around in a giant mech suit sounds really great right about now because I had something stolen off my car, and it would be a lot better to get around in a mech suit. And this is episode 151, How Can Fantastical Satire Sharpen Our Theology? We'll be joined by David Umstattd to talk about The Pilgrim's Progress Reloaded.
Faithful listener, you just missed our discussion about the intricate differences between power armor and a mech suit, but I'm sure David will be available soon to usher us into those different definitions forthwith. First, let's stop by our first sponsor for this episode. It's Enclave Publishing, returning champ with their new novel, Bear Night, from actually our previous episode's guest, James R. Hannibal. He was here talking about spy balloons and fighter planes and such like, but in this book, we're returning to the world of Light Raiders for Light Raider Academy, Book 2. Darkness looms in the Dragonlands, war is brewing, new threats have emerged in Keladev, the Watchmen of Thousand Falls and the Windhold find goblin tunnels in the slopes of the mountain barrier that may hold many dangerous creatures. At the same time, scouting missions into the Dragonlands confirm that the dragons are building an army of tortured Ailadoth villagers to destroy the liberated land. To protect Kara Orso, the young woman Connor and Lee rescued, the headmaster sends them to the second hall to face the intrigues of the assembly in her place. Far to the south, the two cadets learn of an old weapon designed to end the war between the dragons and the liberated land forever. To restore the honor of his family and renew the hope of his people, Connor believes he must find the weapon and use it to destroy the dragon leader. That's the first part of the description of Bear Night, the new novel from James R. Hannibal, Book 2 of the Light Raider Academy series. You can see the cover and more information at lorehaven.com/podcast sponsors, or get that basic link in the show notes for this episode 151.
Well, a few items here from our concession stand. You're going to hear some niche references to things like first-person shooter games and anime. Now, I am not very familiar with a lot of anime, and there are a lot of themes, I guess, if not a few references, but a lot of themes from anime in this audio podcast, The Pilgrim's Progress Reloaded. And it's okay if you're not familiar with those because it's really enjoyable no matter what. Now, I have very much a history of first-person shooter games like Doom and Quake and Halo, but I had to.
I don't, because I was a Christian.
Well, see, this is sort of in my very young Christian
This is when you were a heathan
phase
still.
of life. Yeah, it was my
Christians
freshman year of
never
college.
play those.
Yeah,
Yep.
and I was a very foolish freshman student and got very bad grades in class and literally had to throw away all my video games that year. The point is, you will still enjoy this discussion because we're mostly going to be talking about theology. And you may find your theology, your personal beliefs lightly roasted. And that is kind of the entire point of the Pilgrim's Progress Reloaded. But it is a gentle roast. We're not here to slam anyone, but to kind of laugh at ourselves more than anything else. Because the whole point of allegory and satire is to explore and analyze ideas and not people. And by the way, this is not deconstruction, which we will get into that a little bit later. So I think you'll enjoy it. It's a rip-roaring time through this story.
What I don't enjoy is that large, suspicious shape looming in the sky. Zach, I think we're being besieged by yet another spy balloon or other unidentified flying object. Wait, no, it's okay. It's just our guest. David Umstattd is arriving in a nautical dirigible. Let's tie him down and exit him into the studio. David Umstattd was called to be a writer in 2006. He graduated from Baylor University in 2013 and is the author of The Pilgrim's Progress Reloaded, now a new narrative podcast, soon to be a book form. He lives in North Austin, where his family has lived for 7 generations. David, welcome to the Lorehaven Studios.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Yeah, David, you definitely get the bragging rights there about not just 7th generation Texan, but Austinite. I like to rub it in my California transplant friends' faces that, I've lived here my whole life and you've just come here 2 years, but man, you guys have been here for 100 years. So tell us really quickly about that.
Oh yeah, we came long time ago, basically just after the Texas Revolution, and lots of stories from my family. We've been in Austin, and one of these days we may very well move to Texas.
That's very true. Austin is a neighboring county of Texas.
Indeed. Yes. We sort of have been a front line against all of the weirdness in Austin, trying to keep it from creeping into the rest of Texas.
That's right. And the surrounding areas like Round Rock, keep it mildly unusual rather than weird in Austin proper.
Yeah, thank you for that local shout out. David, especially when you're besieged on all sides by not only nautical dirigibles, but heathens, how did you first discover biblical faith and fantastical imagination?
Well, when I was, I think, a preteen, so I'd always grown up in the church. My family's been strong Christians. And I'd always heard, going to church and hearing Christian things. But it wasn't really until I was exposed to the teachings of Mark Cahill and sort of by relation, Ray Comfort and Kirk Cameron and the way of the Master Ministries, really getting into the law of God, that I really got saved, that I really understood repentance and sin. So much of preaching in when I was growing up, because I was going to a lot of churches, going to churches and having teachings that were sort of like a generation down from the Jesus movement, which is more about you're searching for answers or you're searching for God and you're looking for it in all the right places. And Jesus is the answer, and that you're going to have, if you're depressed or having a bad life, Jesus is the answer to that, and giving you fulfillment and all of these other things, which is true, but it didn't tend to emphasize teachings on like sin as much or the law of God as much. I'm not saying those things are heresy. And one thing you'll learn as we go through this is that more of what I'm trying to teach is that a lot of different movements have emphases on different things, and those things aren't bad, and it's good to emphasize those things. But sometimes when you emphasize a thing, another thing can be de-emphasized. And for me, it was not understanding sin and the law. And so when I saw that emphasis that had sort of been de-emphasized, I repented and turned to God. And shortly after that, I had been toying around with writing, wanting to decide if this is something I wanted to pursue. And it seemed like, oh man, writing never goes anywhere, and is this really a good way to change the culture, and is this what God wants me to do? But then God really independently verified that with me, where we were at a prayer meeting, and someone who didn't know me and had never met me before talked about, like, hey, I don't know if you've been called to be a writer or something, but I feel like God had been asking you to do that. And this is directly after I had been wondering if this was something God wanted
Oh,
me to
wow.
do. And so I was like, well, that settles it. So, and I've been writing ever since. That was back in whenever I told you it was, I think 2006, around then. And that either the same year or the next year I did NaNoWriMo. And I've been doing that on and off and writing various books.
Well, it's fun that you mentioned Ray Comfort and Kirk Cameron, because I have seen a lot of fantastical presentations from them over the years. Kirk Cameron used to have this website where he would sort of like appear through the text, and he would like walk out through this like portal onto your page. And it was very like high tech kind of animation stuff. And I was like, wow, this is a fun presentation. Then at the Answers in Genesis Ark Encounter, there's a presentation they do where Ray Comfort sort of comes out in this little holographic, it's like a Roomba that comes out, and then he's like projected from that. Although it's part of a video, so it was. I wonder if they're actually going to make a holographic Roomba. But that's one thing I love about your story, David. Is there's holograms, there's robots, there's all kinds of sci-fi stuff, and it's not too heavy sci-fi. It's more like geek culture, and it's the anime culture. So it's like the fun sci-fi, I guess is what I could say. But there's a there's a very, like you said, there's something you're trying to teach through this. You're trying to teach some theology, but you're also trying to analyze theology. But that really brings us to a fundamental question, which is, why worry about theology? Why not just have, kind of general vague theology? What are the pitfalls of having a underdeveloped theology?
Well, one of the most important things I would say in terms of theology is it is really important to be specific. And part of that is that one of the ways that I think the enemy tries to trick people is that it will take some sort of very vague truth and then apply it very incorrectly in some sort of specific way. Like, oh, God is love, so love is good. Now, I love being an axe murderer. So because I love that, I feel like I am going to kill you now. See, that's like taking a vague truth and then applying it very badly in a very bad specific way. That's an extreme example, because as someone who writes allegories, I only write extreme examples, and because those are funny. But there are other subtler ways where they will not apply it in quite such an extreme example, but still in a way that's wrong. And you can do that with any good value, whether it's truth, whether it's justice or compassion. Anytime you look at a bad movement, it's usually always born out of some sort of correct virtue, and the enemy uses that appeal to that correct virtue to do bad things. And that goes back all the way to the Garden of Eden, where, the devil will use the words of God and then twist them. And even when the devil was confronting Jesus, he would reference scripture. And that's why it's really good, I think, to have. That's why the Bible is so long. The Bible is not on accident, but because God is actually quite complicated, and there's actually a lot of facets to the Christian life. I'm not saying that you have to be like smart to be a Christian, or you have to have everything all together to be a Christian. God uses our weaknesses. I mean, God used a literal donkey, so I would like to think I'm somewhat more intelligent than that at times. But the idea is there's a lot of facets to Christianity, and that if you ignore certain ones of that, it can result in either extreme or subtle.
I think that is so important to note. Even thinking about your life story that you mentioned earlier, David, where you said it was what some people would call a prophetic word from someone who didn't even know you that set you on the course toward being a writer. You just got specific with a belief there, or at least an expression of belief, a practice from a fellow Christian. And some listeners then, I don't think I'm among them, but some listeners would be more what they call cessationist, and they'd say, well, that's not how God speaks. God speaks through his word, and anything else is just at best a providential ordering of events. Well, at that point, we're just quibbling over what you call it, when God maybe is more providential than usual in what someone might say to you that ends up changing your life. But other Christians are not so cautious about such things. They feel very grounded enough in their love for Jesus as revealed in the scripture. And so they're more open to saying that something like that is prophetic. Similar to what you mentioned, the way of the master, which, by the way, folks who don't know the title of that ministry, those are the guys who used to go out on TV or on YouTube clips and say, have you ever told a lie? Okay, what does that make you? A liar, that's right. Have you ever taken something that doesn't belong to you? This is indeed a very simple, useful, practical, street preacher-friendly application of the law, quickly followed up by the gospel. But I totally agree with Ray and Kirk there, the dynamic duo once upon a time, that you absolutely have to bring the law into a discussion like that and not just assume that everybody already knows that. All those signposts in culture have been lost. And it is the job, I think, of a Christian-made satire to bring back some of those extremes, as you called them. You cannot embrace Jesus without being at least lightly roasted, because we are all rebel sinners, like your Christian figure in the Pilgrim's Progress Reloaded, who need to flee from the wrath to come and go on a quest toward the celestial city.
Yeah, the law is so important that he's a character in my book. And I would argue he's the second best character in the book. Everybody knows who the first best character is, and no one who has read the book debates on that. Yeah, everyone knows. It's even in one of the chapter titles. One of the gimmicks of any sort of Pilgrim's Progress adaptation is that every character or thing has to be named 100% after what it is. Not all allegories do that, but
yeah, I like the town of fair speech. Yeah.
The whole point of Pilgrim's Progress is to be wildly overt in what stuff is. And then from that foundation, you get to do fun stuff by having, I was like, okay, what would a character of truth be like in the city of morality? What's the interplay there and the interconnection of what the conflicts would be?
You mentioned how you came from this kind of background of just like, oh, Jesus just wants to shore up my weaknesses. He just wants to love you. He wants to meet my needs. And again, all things that are true, he said, come to me, you who are weary and burdened.
Yes, again, these are not false things.
Yeah, and listeners of the show know that one of my favorite passages in the Bible is Acts 17, where Paul says, from one man he made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, so that people would seek him and perhaps reach out for him and find him. And so I believe that God has put a desire and a pointer back to him in every people and culture, but it's not enough just to have that desire, because sin gets in the way. And Paul goes on to say in that passage, look, God does not live in temples built by human hands. So he confronts their idolatry while at the same time sort of affirming that they are moving in the right direction generally, but there is a specific revelation that they need. And that specific revelation has to do with sin and judgment, as Jesus himself said. That is exactly what I see you doing in this, in the Pilgrim's Progress Reloaded, is that you are, you're kind of taking no prisoners, but it's a gentle roast. And we'll get into that a little bit later. I see what you're saying is that if we just latch on to one idea and one approach, and we don't have a robust approach to the Bible, and even if we just kind of ignore it a little bit or just take just verses, we don't really deal with the text of the Bible. That's, I think, how we get to that very shallow understanding. Now, you heard in the intro, there's the clip from your first episode where Book, the holographic Bible character, says to Christian, question me, analyze me, debate me, get angry, hate me, just don't ignore me. I'm strong enough to handle your objections in vitriol. I like that you put that in there, David, because I think that sometimes people are afraid to really get into theological analysis because they worry, what if I start digging into this and I can't find the answers, or I don't like the answers, or maybe the Bible can't take that amount of questioning. We'll get into a little bit of like, there's good questioning and bad questioning. There's good analysis, and then there's just postmodern deconstruction, and that's going to be a future episode. I think it takes just a simple underlying assumption, which is that the Bible is true. If you come at it with the Bible is true and God is real, ask whatever question you want. And I think you can get to a good point about that. But I wanted to ask you, like, how did you land on that as a theme? Like, is this? I'm not too familiar with the original Bunyan novel, so is this something that he put in there as well, or is it something a little more original to you, or some combination?
Well, that specific line from book is from me. In the original Pilgrim's Progress, book is not anthropomorphized. But there is a sort of sense in the original Pilgrim's Progress of wanting to delve into a lot of these issues and debate things. And again, in a gentle roasting for the most part. There's entire sequences in the book where they're basically hashing out ideas. There's even allegories within allegories. Christian is taken through this series of images where they're like, okay, look at this allegory. It has this specific meaning. And it's sort of anti this whole, oh, just follow what the priest says because he's the priest and this is what we follow and this is what we believe, so just do it. And in the second book, there's this entire sequence where Christiana's children get what I believe is referred to as being catechized, where they're basically like, okay, explain Christianity to me and we're going to debate against you and then ask all of these really tough questions against you, like what is the meaning of life and why should you be believing in the Bible and these type of things, and then they answer it. And this is sort of like seen as like a normal thing, where they almost play devil's advocate, these catechizers. I forget who does it specifically. I think it's Watchful, but I could be wrong on that. So there is this sort of pro-debate sense in Pilgrim's Progress, which at the time was more new. Like when Martin Luther, which again was about 200 years before Pilgrim's Progress, he kept wanting to do these debates with priests, and very often they would just not want to because they felt like it legitimized this. And there was this fear that if there was debate, people might believe the wrong thing, as if God is like, oh, we have to protect God from like bad ideas, and we have to protect the Bible because people might read the Bible wrong or believe a wrong thing about God. And yeah, people might do that, but I don't know if you know about this, but like God is actually like quite powerful and doesn't need our protection. And it absolutely is silly to think that we have to like protect the things of God from bad ideas. The things of God are stronger than bad ideas.
You said that Luther tried to get into these debates, and of course, a whole Reformation broke out, and he had a lot of tragedy befall him for kind of going against the powers that be. What was the case with Bunyan? Because again, I don't know too much of the history, but he got in a little bit of trouble because of this book and his push for more theological debate. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, well, he wrote Pilgrim's Progress in prison for theological reasons, if I remember correctly.
Okay, so he was already in trouble, and then he wrote the book.
He was preaching the gospel in defiance.
Yeah, that's how you get a writer to write a book. You throw them in jail. And then, they have nothing else to do, so they write. So yeah, the first Pilgrim's Progress was written in prison. The second one, I don't believe, was... For those of you who don't know, there are two Pilgrim's Progress books. If you buy Pilgrim's Progress, you will most likely be given a volume that includes both books. It is interesting reading the second one because he got a whole lot of mail responses, letters and such. And some people debating the theology and claiming that, oh, because this certain thing happened in a certain order, you're claiming this about salvation, that you don't actually need to have repented first. And then in the second book, he's like, okay, I'm going to switch the order of this, because you have to be very, very careful with a Pilgrim's Progress allegory with like the events that things happen, or even the description of a character, because the way that the whole medium or genre works is that any description or detail has to have some sort of theological significance to it, or you're writing about that allegory. And a cynic in me would say that the second book is sort of like a patch to the first one, because like he goes to the Wicket Gate, in a different order, and that's why the first book opens with a poem of him where the author apologizes for writing this book, which I have a version of that isn't in the audiobook. That'll be in the physical book. It's sort of a self roast because again, you want to roast everybody in the book, including myself, and so the opening sequence, which isn't in the audiobook, but I plan on putting in the physical book, is this forward where I apologize for the writing of the book and all of basically like explaining the problems with allegory and with like fiction writing in general as a means to communicate theology. But he still does it. And I think that's actually really useful. And it shows a lot of humility on Bunyan's part, which I think is really good.
If you want to hear more about John Bunyan and the original Pilgrim's Progress in the sequel, you can actually go to our episode 104, where we interviewed Zachary Bartles, who's doing another Pilgrim's Progress podcast, a more straightforward adaptation, but also filling in some stuff. That episode is called What If You Fled from God's Wrath into Puritan Allegory, where we're going to ask David for his take on allegory in just a moment. First of all, just as Bunyan's original hero, Christian, had to fight Apollyon, this devilish, dragonish creature, so you may need to get a dragon slayer of your own. And that leads us to sponsor number 2, author Carrie Green with the Dragon Slayer Chronicles. A dragon attack on a dark evening strips a 6-year-old boy from his family, changing his life forever. As he grows from boy to man, Han's hatred for the beasts fuels his life's purpose, to recruit and train a band of dragon slayers to destroy the monsters. But the beasts do not act alone. Their evil masters, adherents of an ancient ancestral cult, have taken blood oaths that together they and their dragons will dominate all the lands. Han's epic battle against the dragon masters and their ferocious monsters will test his courage, require unimaginable sacrifices, and cause him to question the justice and wisdom of his creator. The Dragon Slayer Chronicles is a 3-part Christian speculative fantasy series by pastor, podcaster, and author Carrie Green. You can get all the description, the buy link, and the cover at lorehaven.com/podcast sponsors, or get that basic link in our show notes for episode 151.
Well, let's go into chapter 2, where we're going to talk about how does allegory work? How is it different than parables? What are the rules of allegory? And especially because you are taking these different virtues and ideas and you're turning them into people. And so when you have these people in a scene, or you have someone missing, even that, just the presence or absence of a character who's representing something like truth or love or zeal, the different dynamics and how they are arranged, even that makes a statement. So tell us about that, David.
Yeah, so that's one of the things that I think was only toyed with a little bit in the original Pilgrim's Progress. It was to a degree. There were lots of characters named after ideals, but there wasn't as many. Most of them were Christian comes across this bad philosophy or this bad ideal, and then he tries to trick Christian and either succeeds or fails. And I still have that a lot, but I also have good virtues as what I refer to with the Japanese word nakama, which is a stronger word for friend. And of course, all the weeaboos out there will get angry and say, no, you're not explaining it well enough. But basically, Christian eventually gets the companions of love, truth, and zealot, who all have very different and distinct personalities. And all of them are either tricked or not tricked by the various enemies that Christian comes across, whether that's worldly wise men or Gnosticism or spiritual attacks of various kinds. The spiritual attack dog I have as a thing. And so each of them, or more or fewer of them, respond to it in different ways. And it's basically illustrating the fact that we need to have all of the Christian virtues in order to live a good Christian life. And it's also fun to have, truth and love arguing with each other. They're sort of bickering but friendly sisters, and showing the conflict between the three. And when one is gone, and then also at some point you get to see evil versions of all three, except for truth, which I only hint at. And that's interesting because there's also like the devil has their own corrupted version of love or zealotry. With love, it's masochism. That's like the evil version of love. And so these are all things that you can explore in an allegory, especially when you're very overt about it, that you wouldn't in a normal story. And so theologically, there's a lot of potential for it, but it makes it really hard to write. Don't write allegories, guys, because like you have to do twice as much work for half as much value, because you still have to follow all the same story writing rules, making characters interesting and having good pacing and plot. But now every time you do one of those, you also have to be like, okay, but what are the theological ramifications of this?
Well, particularly with the idea of truth not having an evil version, presumably with a goatee from the mirror universe. But I can easily imagine this corrupted version of love, or certainly zealotry. We certainly see a lot of that going on in the real world, and there's nothing allegorical about it. It's just real. David, did you have any particular personal theological grievances you got to work through with this story? Like, for example, like some of the common villains that some of our listeners might find, even among professing Christians, acting up on social media or politics. Like, was there anybody you were like, felt really convicted about afterwards. Like, I'm going to put him in here and I'm going to get him. I'm going to get him with my allegory.
So I didn't go after any individuals. One of the big appeals of allegories in general is that you get to go after ideas.
Yes.
I had a lot of fun deconstructing, and this is the one time I do deconstruct atheism. That was really great.
Yeah, they deserve it. Yeah.
Zach says it's his favorite part in the whole book is my representation of atheist.
Yeah.
And I have a really fun sequence, which is what is effectively a gang war between two rival gangs, one of which is the Calvinists and the other is the Armenians. And I sort of attack both of them, not even necessarily about the actual debate of predestination, but with the format and the culture of the debate of predestination. Because while the book is generally very pro-debate, I also am like, well, I have to go after everybody. And one of them is the people who debate badly or debate in the wrong spirit. Oh, and I would like to say there is an evil version of truth. It's occultism. That would be what I call the evil. Like you're valuing the pursuit of truth that you try to find out all of these like bad and evil things. So that would be the evil version of truth.
Trying to find truth in all these mystical and hidden and Gnostic kind of sources.
Yes, that Gnostic is a character who shows up.
Oh, that's true. That's even a character.
And fools everybody but truth. Oh. And then when truth is there, they're like, oh, well, I have my own truth. And he has this like android robot version of truth, which truth is really insulted by.
My truth.
And love just loves the guy. It's like, oh yeah, I like, pursuing God and having spiritual enlightenment. I love those things. And Gnostic's like, yeah, I like those things too. And truth is like, but this is a robot. This isn't me. And they think that truth is like their slave because his robot is his slave. And he's convinced that their truth is a robot. Mm-hmm. And she keeps claiming she's not a robot. And it's like, yeah, that's what robots always say. Because that's the sort of the idea behind a lot of the spiritualism is you have your own version of truth. And in this, it's literal, but no, there isn't. There is the truth.
Now, the interesting thing there is that you've mentioned two of the villains, atheist and Gnostic. But as I recall from the book, there aren't too many villains that are outside the Christian faith. A lot of the conflict is happening between basically the Christian characters. And earlier you said that, hey, look, the Christian faith can stand up to debate. It can withstand questions. Yeah, and also, like you said, God doesn't have to be defended. So are you kind of making a statement even about that with the limited number of villains in the story?
Well, one thing that I think a lot of Christians and Christian writers make as a mistake is they think, oh, I want to get a whole bunch of non-Christians to read this book. To a degree, you can write books that a lot of non-Christians will read. If I'm writing Pilgrim's Progress, the number of non-Christians that are going to read this book is very, very low. And so I have a whole lot more to say about Christians than non-Christians in this because I want to benefit Christians who read the book. So, and the original Pilgrim's Progress is also like that. It's really about the Christian walk. And that's most useful to Christians. I do have and that's why in the original Pilgrim's Progress and mine, the non-Christian elements are seen as like these antagonistical forces that are trying to stop Christian. And it's like, okay, how do you deal with those? So really it is a book for Christians. Non-Christians can read it. It's easy the original Pilgrim's Progress, I think, maybe goes to this in maybe too much of a binary degree. But there are exceptions to that. There are parts where there are things like Worldly Wise Men or Little Faith who are like, okay, so this thing has a bad element to it. Which is more accurate to generally how things work. So like in my book, one of the twists is that atheist ends up helping them defeat fascist, which is another thing that they come against. Because fascist is basically like to clamp down and control all of these beliefs, and the atheists want to believe their own thing. And so one of the twists is sort of like there are these people who believe these bad things, but some of the things that they believe can, like, there are very few people out there who every single thing that they believe is wrong. Maybe that person exists, but it's more common that some of the things that they believe are wrong. And that if you just attack everything that they believe, it's not going to be productive, and you're going to end up tearing down values or beliefs that they have that are good that need to be built up. And the general like cynicism and pursuit of truth that atheists have is a good thing. The problem is it's being misused.
Well, that's an important distinction between Reloaded versus the OG of Pilgrim's Progress, in that, yes, Bunyan is writing to his audience. He's writing what he knows. He's not trying to get people saved, that chronic affliction that some Christian authors tell themselves, oh, I'm going to write a very wholesome story for Christians that somehow is going to appeal to all those non-Christian readers I imagine are out there. And generally that ends up really not being the case. And I don't even know if it should be the case. There are better reasons to write a book. Evangelism is a wonderful bonus if you can get it, but not the chief end. The original Pilgrim's Progress has these external forces to Christian and to faithful and to hopeful and any of the other heroes walking along the narrow way. Everybody is a Christian, just a Christian who's a Christian. There's no different denominations. Like everybody's just a good Puritan. Very much a good Puritan. Well, that's what John Bunyan was. That's what he knew. Interesting then to find out that Reloaded deals with a little bit more of these intra-Christian or intra-evangelical wars. I'm amused by the idea of a gang war between the Calvinists and the Arminians. I would just hope that at least the Calvinists are locked inside their cages where they need to be within the first few years or months of learning about the doctrines of grace. That's a trope the Calvinists have come up for themselves. I think rightly so, saying there's a cage stage. And I think that applies to more than just someone getting a hold of particular reformed ideas. Christians, especially when they hit like a second wind, call it the Holy Spirit or whatever, they go to that one, like, may have grown up in a Christian family all their lives. Then they go to that one youth group or read that one devotional or take that one mission trip. And suddenly it's no fault of their own church or their own family necessarily, just something clicks and the Holy Spirit moves in. And it's like getting born again. Like, as for when you were saved, I don't know, but something happens where, maybe a few times in your life, you just feel almost like a personal revival and you make that faith your own all over again. And that's helpful to know that can happen. But it's also helpful to play out some of the fights that Christians have, even though we're all on the narrow way. So I look forward to finding out how that works in your particular version. I would hope to see some of my own favorite frenemies along the way too. Theo bros. Anybody heard about Theo bros? I call it. Some of them aren't just bros. I can deal with the bro, but if you're a Theo thug, then I'm probably going to try to shove you off the narrow way and maybe then repent of it.
Yeah, I wish I had heard of that term or knew of it before I wrote the book, because I probably would have either included it or had more overt
Mr.
versions
Theo
of
bro.
that character. In a sense, in mind, the Armenians and the Calvinists are both Theo bros who are kind of going at it against each other. And that is sort of juxtaposed as the opposite of the platitude platypus, which is more of a dig on charismatic style teaching, where you're talking these vague platitudes that everyone agrees with that have no like foundational, like specific meaning. Is like, we must pursue intently towards the furtherance of God's kingdom in our everyday life.
Oh, that's so true, man.
Yes, man, that's powerful. What on earth does that mean? It means basically nothing. And the platitude platypus basically is this preacher, and that's all he says. And everyone is really like, oh man, this is so great. And Truth is like, what? And it's like, we must take action against the forces of evil. Zealot's like, yeah, no action. I like that. It's like, we must care for people in a tender and purposeful way. And Love is like, oh yeah. Or like he says Love at one point, and Love starts fangirling. It's like, hey, he said my name. He must be for me. And Truth is like, what is going on? I don't understand what any of this means. That's sort of a going after some of the problems of theological weakness or lightness. And then also I go after the being overly antagonistical about theology. Because again, we're imperfect humans, and that's one of the things that I think a lot of debaters of theology get wrong. Is like, we can figure out God perfectly. The Bible is
we're
like
all
this
brains
formula
and
where we
tanks.
can understand everything and all knowledge. I don't really think that's true. I don't think humans are as that good at understanding theology that we can understand all mysteries. Everything in the Bible is true and useful. But the idea that we can figure out all mysteries, I think it kind of comes from this Enlightenment era thing where science was advancing. It's like, oh, we can figure out this, we can figure out that. Maybe we can just figure out God and figure out how he works. And to a degree, that's true. But it can't be done perfectly. And I think we have to understand that.
Zach, I'm catching on to the aesthetic here, and now I'm wishing that in Pilgrim's Progress Reloaded, we'd gotten an evil android bent on destruction of all pictures of Jesus to vaporize them with his built-in ray guns, and the robot's name would be 2CV.
There we go. Going back in a minute, David, to something you said earlier about the atheist being a partial or temporary ally. to Christian because of this pursuit of truth. I really like that element because I'm seeing that play out a lot today in a lot of culture wars. There are a lot of atheists, conservative atheists, that are allied with Christians on some common grievances that we have with, how schools are taking a very hard left turn, for example. So I like that that is happening, whereas, because it's sort of culture war 2.0. Culture war 1.0 was, Bill Nye versus Ken Ham, type of atheist versus Christian type of things. So I like that how you said that there is often common ground we can find with everyone. And, this can lead to this sort of sentimentalism, like, oh, we're all just the same. We're all just blind men, groping around an elephant and trying to figure out what it is. But by this kind of careful, ongoing analysis that you have through the book, I think we get away from that kind of sentimentalism. But I think that one thing it can lead us to, talking about the Theo bro kind of persona, is that dogmatism can come up. And that is sort of a monster in the story. Can you tell us about that and how allegory helps express the danger of dogmatism?
Yeah, dogmatism is one of the big enemies that they fight. And he's sort of the opposite of, say, pluralism, which is another big thing that I go against, that I'm really against. And I didn't want there to be this spirit of, oh, well, there's this element of truth in some of these other religions or ideologies, and so we all just need to get together and sort of pursue God on our own. It's like, no, atheism is wrong, Buddhism is wrong. I have an entire character named False Religion was a really fun character to write. That character sort of wrote himself. But in terms of dogmatism, that's sort of we're sort of focusing on a very specific sequence in the book, because it's this gang war between atheists and Armenians, and eventually they get into this Pokemon style battle where they're using Bible verses like Pokemon that they throw out and return, trying to make the Bible fight itself. Which at first doesn't work. The Bible doesn't. The different books they're throwing out are just like friendly, and they're like, "Oh, hello, how are you today? Oh, I'm doing fine." And they're like, "No, you have to fight." And it's like, "I don't want to fight her." And then they like reprogram their books so that then they start fighting, which is basically
it's Calvinists and Armenians, right?
Calvinists and Armenians.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Not Arminians, although I make a joke about that, about how the two words are very similar. And basically, it turns out that the person that's trying to promote this fight is this tentacle monster named Dogmatism, who's secretly trying to basically use this debate and actual pursuit towards truth as a internal fight. That it results in a lot of a big epic fight scene, because most of the conflicts in this book are resolved with big gunfire, because the gunfire is representing theological fights going on, or a battlefield of ideas. But it's more fun to show that when mechs are slicing skyscrapers in half, or you have somebody with a pistol that can fire infinite missiles. And that just makes things easier to understand for my generation, I think. I think the biggest problem with the original Pilgrim's Progress is there were no robots, no space marines, and infinite missile launchers.
Yeah. Now, what is the difference between a mech and power armor in this story?
The difference is what the actual difference is in real life. It's actually very well defined. A mech has to have three things. It has to have a cockpit, it has to have arms, and it has to have legs. If it has a cockpit and just legs, that's what's referred to as a walker. That's what you have in Star Wars. Those are not mechs. If it has a cockpit and just arms, that's basically just like a turret or something. I don't know. I mean, that's not really a thing. If it has wheels, that's just like a tank that you have. But basically, it's a robot that you can drive. Power armor is what you see with something like Iron Man. It has arms and legs, but it has no cockpit. You're not pressing a button to make your arm move. You're moving your arm, and then your arm moves. So that's armor. It's just like a suit of armor that's electric.
And how does this represent different things in the story?
So one of the more iconic things in Pilgrim's Progress is the burden on Christian. And that's one of the big things that I had to get right. It's like, what's the sci-fi version of just a pack on his back? Like, well, I could just do it as a pack on his back, but this is the sci-fi version. I have to have the sci-fi version of everything. So what I have him encased in a suit of power armor that's like permanently fused to his body, which is really what sin is. it's this thing that's like part of our flesh and affixed to it, but we are still like meant to be different from it, meant to be separated from it, to be pulled out of that power armor, which is actually a theme in a lot of sci-fi. This idea of people being permanently put in armor that they can't leave, and it being like a prison, and they're like slave soldiers or something. And so I sort of took that idea, and I was like, that's really a lot like what sin and our sin nature is. And it's like it has this programming that is influencing him that he's trying to resist. And he, at the very beginning of the story, basically has to power down the armor. And then he has to try to move around with with these like, this super heavy metal armor that has no power, that's meant to operate via servos and electronics. And that's a lot like trying to fight against sin without God on our side. It's like, we can try a little bit, but ultimately we fail. And it's not possible for us to succeed, which is a reoccurring theme in the book, is that Christian has to repeatedly try to do things that he knows that he's going to fail at, because he has to trust in God, or what I refer to as the overseer, because that's just another term for Lord, and it's a more sci-fi-y term.
Well, you've already heard much about how David Umstattd made this realm for the Pilgrim's Progress Reloaded. Our actual first interview with him was at the Realm Makers conference a few years ago. We'll try to get that link in our show notes, but we're also going to move to our sponsor, which is that same conference, Realm Makers 2023. They are back in St. Louis, Missouri this July. Hundreds of writers who create fantasy, science fiction, and other stories will join the Christian-led organization for its 11th annual conference. That'll be from July 13th through 15th, getting more specific there in St. Louis. You can register at realmmakers.com for the event and choose to attend in person. It'll be hosted at the Sheraton Westport Chalet Hotel, or you can join the live stream from home on the dedicated Realmsphere social network. Says the co-owner and CEO, Rebecca P. Miner, we at Realmmakers have enjoyed the privilege for over a decade of connecting Christian creators to one another and to opportunities in the publishing marketplace. We're not just about bringing expert faculty to the conference for teaching, although that's one of the pillars of what we do. We've also discovered that a writer's success is tied into relationships one way or another. The annual conference offers a supportive environment where authors can take the next step in their creative journey. You can learn more by going to lorehaven.com/podcast sponsors. Look for the Realm Makers tab at the top there. We also have a news release when registration opened that we will link to at that page. And of course, the registration link directly at realmmakers.com, and get that basic link in our show notes for episode 151.
All right, let's move into chapter 3. We're going to be talking about how satire helps us sharpen our minds. If you've been a Christian for a while, you've probably had, as Stephen mentioned, the mountaintop experience from a youth group or a mission trip, or just some really awesome sermon, and you just think, oh man, now I know what to do and what everyone else needs to hear. And you can get carried away, and I can think of moments in my own life where it's kind of cringe thinking back on that. And so what are we talking about? We're talking about zealotry, right? Just this passion to jump into one thing and then kind of laser focus on a certain issue. And David, this is what I love about your story, is that you actually have a character, like you said, is the best character in the book. So tell me about that. Why is this character so good, and like why is it so relatable to think about zeal?
I see, this in this sense was almost a real surprise to me, because one of the things that we talk about so little as Christians is the actual value in taking action. So often we're like, well, you got to believe stuff, and you have to have faith, and you have to, be loving, and you got to love people and believe stuff, and all of this stuff that goes on in your mind. And that's all true. But there's a whole lot of stuff in the Bible talking about like the walk of following God and taking action and doing things. And that is a virtue in and of itself that we don't talk to about. So the ability and capacity to actually do things in the tangible world. But that element in and of itself is just like aggression and action. And when you personify that, it's really, really funny, because Zealot doesn't have any intelligence, either emotional intelligence or proper intelligence. He just wants to do things. He wants to protag. He wants to shoot all of the monsters. And anytime he comes across a problem that he can't solve by shooting, it always irks him and gets him mad. And he's very dumb. He has so much conflict with Truth. And there's this sort of running joke where Zealot will just make up words and Truth will get really upset by that. Most of it is that he's the most action-y character. And anytime any part of the story is even beginning to start to get a little slow, because Pilgrim's Progress, mine and the original, and any version of this, there's a whole lot of people just talking about theology. And anytime that starts to go too far, Zealot will usually start shooting stuff or say something funny or do some sort of big action-packed thing. And in a sense, I think the readers relate to that because they're like, yeah, make stuff interesting happen, do stuff. And he seems like a joke, but and he does have some of the best jokes and the best lines. Basically, I based him off of Reinhardt from Overwatch.
Okay.
I've also heard him described as a combination between like Buzz Lightyear and Kronk. He's this.
That's a perfect description. Yes.
Both voiced by Patrick Warburton at one point.
Yeah.
Yes. The original Buzz Lightyear TV show, which no one talks about and is excellent, by the way. But yeah, Zealot is very much this big, aggressive, burly, but lovable. I don't know. I don't really want to call him a thug because while he has sort of a lack of control, he's not necessarily immoral. So he doesn't tend to just do bad action. He just does all of the action. And the voice is really fun. I had a lot of fun with the voice for Zealot. He has one of the more iconic
Do you do
voices.
a Patrick Warburton voice? I haven't gotten there yet.
No, I do. He's closer to Reinhardt, but not with the accent. He's sort of like an English version.
Okay. Wow, English Kronk. Right, the poison. The poison specifically chose to kill Cusco.
Well, no. English as opposed to the German accent.
Oh, I see.
German accent.
I got you.
I see.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah, his personality maybe is more like Kronk, and that he's this burly, and that he just sort of there's no subtlety to him. So there's a whole lot of like nuance and subtlety in the book, and Zealot has no subtlety, and so he just says things as they are and does and like explains things overtly and in a way that helps a whole lot in this story.
Yeah. Now you mentioned that the point of Zealot is to bring attention to the fact that we do need to take action as Christians. We don't just sit around and meditate or whatever all day. We need to be doers of the word, not just hearers of the word. But what's the far end of that you're trying to sort of caution readers against in this form of Kronk plus Buzz Lightyear? Like what is sort of the excess of that you're trying to say?
In terms of excess, you had mentioned that a few times, and my one thing I would like to say is that the pursuit of God is not the idea that certain virtues can be done in excess, but more that they can be done in an imbalance. And an imbalance doesn't mean, because so often as Christians we're like, oh, we have an imbalance. I have too much love or too much truth. I need to have less of that thing. And that is not the way that you want to be thinking. You need to be thinking, I need to increase my other things, because Jesus and God is the maximum of all the stats, the maximum of all the virtues. So it's not that like there's an excess of zealotry, but in the book, obviously, it's when he does bad things or encourages Christian to go in a wrong path or to do an incorrect thing because he just wants to take action. And sometimes they have to stop and think about stuff, or to change their thinking. Zealot's the kind of person who will be going in the wrong direction forever, and it just be like, oh, well, I just need to move faster is the problem. That's not the solution. Sometimes you need to turn around or stop. Zealot hates that kind of stuff. So, and he's fooled by the platitude platypus, who's like, oh, we need to do these things that are good and and take good action. And Zealot's like, yeah, I agree with that, but that has no like actual substance to it. At first he's caught up in the fight between the Armenians and the Calvinists, because it's like, oh yeah, fighting, I like that. But they're fighting each other, and that's not something he's able to pick up, because he sees any problem and wants to attack it, which is a good virtue. But again, that can result in you attacking either the wrong people or aggressive in a way that's counterproductive. So he also has sort of a love is often pulling him back, and all three of them are keeping the other ones in check when success happens.
Yeah. And what I like about all this is that every one of those scenes is funny. Like it's just enjoyable. It's very self-aware and even self-referential at times. Like you mentioned, the story even roasts the author. And so there's
quite literally in the most recent episode. Yeah.
So there's this playfulness to it. And, I think that humor can be very disarming. It can be an acceptable form of preachiness, to use satire. But at the same time, like satire stings. It can really poke at us. So is this going to make a lot of readers upset in a certain sense? Are they going to be clicking the button like, hey, I'm in this picture and I don't like it?
Not if they have a sense of humor. but maybe that's me being cynical. It isn't really malicious towards any Christian denominations, even if they're believing things that I think are wrong. That I think is important. Deconstructionism is easy. It's easy to tear something down, like to just like destroy the whole thing and break it down into its components parts. It's very hard to be like, here's the one thing in this bit that maybe isn't good and the rest are good. And that's way more useful and a lot more harder. The writing this book was really hard. There's a modern sense that we want to deconstruct things and just try to take them down to their base components and explain how all of it is bad. And that very usually gets rid of a lot of good stuff. I never really was very overt about like specific denominations. The only exception is the Armenians and the Calvinists because it's such an obvious example. And it's played up as a joke where for the first half of the scene, they're like, there's this debate going on between the two of them. It's like, who are these people? And Truth, who one of the ongoing jokes is that Truth is semi-omniscient, so she breaks the fourth wall all the time because she understands that she's in an allegory, and she's like, oh, well, I think the author just doesn't have the guts to, actually point out a specific denomination. So I'm pretty sure it's just an example of a aggressive theologian. And then one of the Calvinists is like, and I'm a Calvinist, and I don't care what you think. And then Truth's like, oh, never mind. So yeah, there's a lot of jokes like that, self-referential all the time. And part of that is because it's an allegory, and allegories are intentionally self-referential. So that kind of humor, which is pretty popular, it's sort of starting to wane in popularity right now, but it fits really well with an allegory because allegories in themselves are very self-referential and very fourth wall breaking. But there's also, various other types of humor. People have said it's very, very funny, and it certainly was written as a comedy. Not all of the chapters are super comedic, but like there's only a couple in there that aren't super comedic. I try to keep everybody laughing so that they enjoy the work, because if they don't enjoy the work, then it's not going to go anywhere.
Yeah, and I think that's you've got the right formula there, because there is a lot of comedy that can just be mean, that just makes fun of people, and like you said, just to tear them down. And then there's the comedy that is often called clapter. You're not really making a joke; you're making a statement that that your audience already agrees with. And I've also heard it called, you're just tossing red meat to the audience, and so you're pleasing them, but you're not really elevating them or challenging them. And so I think that's why satire, like a light roast, as we've been saying, is so important, because it helps the reader, it helps the audience pursue truth in a fun way, not taking themselves too seriously, laughing at themselves a little bit. And that really shows love for the reader, is that you're giving them a good time while, getting them to look in the mirror a little bit, but not in a hurtful way, not in a deconstructionist way, but looking for the truth and trying to clear out error, while at the same time acknowledging that there is a solid foundation. Our faith is built on the rock, it's built on Christ, and it's built on the apostles and the prophets too. That's something a lot of people leave out, is that we are part of the church. We're not just Christians who have a Bible. Like, we are part of a rich tradition, and there are absolutely these foundational things we have to hold on to. And that's part of, and we'll get into this in another episode, but that's part of what's the matter with the deconstructionist movement, is it wants to clear everything out and sort of try to rediscover this hidden knowledge about the Bible that's been there all along. And that's basically arrogance. It's like thinking, everyone had it wrong until 2023, basically, until I came along.
Yeah, be wary of anyone who's like, oh, this is some new truth that I found.
Right.
Like, the world has been around long enough and the Bible has been around long enough that it's pretty unlikely you're going to find some new thing. And in terms of satire, I think one of the best ways to sort of keep one of the best satires, I think, are ones that tend to go after lots of different groups. Because the bad satire is like, this group is bad and my group is good. And to an extent, Christianity, yes, is trying to say that. Christianity is right. Our group is good. But like, that doesn't mean that there aren't flaws with it that we can't point out to try to improve on. With like the culture. Obviously, there's no problems with the Bible or with God. The satirical elements there aren't. I do a different type of humor with the book. It's more their inability to appreciate or understand it. That's the joke. But I think if you are able to go after lots of different groups fairly, then those groups, when they are being gone after, see that you were, they agreed with you when you went after the other groups. And so they're more willing to listen when you're criticizing them. And so I think it builds goodwill. And so everybody gets their turn to be made fun of. But because everybody gets their turn, it's kind of okay at that point, I think.
Well, just so we're all taking turns. And that's something that we need to get used to doing. I think that's something that, David, that a healthy church can do. Like, I mean, not just the church with the capital C, all of evangelicals or whatever your denomination is, but it's a healthy environment when people can feel free to tease each other. And if you're not able to laugh at yourself and your own proclivities, then first, you're probably not on the path toward holiness, toward being like Jesus, which is the whole point of the thing. But also, you're probably not going to be much fun to be around. I think we've all been in conversations where it's very clear, oh, this person takes him or herself way too seriously. Or even in an internet comment section where somebody is clearly there working out some personal issues that they have by going in all in for this particular theological perspective that now is not so much about the issues, but is more of a language for that person's own personal issues. And you can't point that out because they'll get mad. And believe me, I've tried. But it's also, I think, a caution to move a little towards this kind of lightness. Now, I'm famously against flippancy. Another famous satire, the Screwtape Letters, C.S. Lewis has the evil demon Screwtape say that his favorite sense of humor is not fun or joy or the joke proper, but flippancy. Because flippancy just in the wrong way makes fun of everything and takes nothing seriously. So I'm not talking about that. But another earlier writer, G.K. Chesterton, has written that angels can fly because they take themselves lightly, but Satan fell through force of gravity. And it means gravity like Satan to take himself way too seriously. Like the devil and even C.S. Lewis's fictional devils cannot laugh at themselves. They are way too important for that. They're way too stuck up and full of themselves. I forget which other writer it is who says a man full of himself makes a very small package indeed. This is, I think, that's what I'm hearing you talk about. And in that case, this is the kind of satire that I enjoy the most. It's not so much us over here making fun of those guys over there and just reinforcing our own side, but kind of some of the satire you still see at the Babylon Bee and from other writers. You see Christians making fun of not just other Christians, but ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
I think that that's a really healthy place to be. And it really ought to be making fun. Like the point is fun. That is happiness. That ought to be a happy thing that we do. You ought to be able to look at yourself and go, yeah, I go a little too far with that virtue. Or, wow, I was really in the cage stage about XYZ back then. And now I can see that in other people. But I really don't want to do the same thing about another issue, something else that comes up, no matter how true it is. I think that's where both allegory and satire and just fiction or creativity altogether are an excellent God-given check on that. I think it's just a reminder that all of our nonfiction interests aren't just a bunch of ideas floating around in a tank, but we are embodied persons. We are human beings. We are awesome and created by God, but we're also kind of funny when you think about it.
Yeah, humor is our capacity to enjoy finding flaws in things, which is a good virtue to have because it's important to find flaws as long as we then take action to change them. Again, I'm getting back to the zealotry thing, but yeah, humor is a value, and it's good either as a coping mechanism or as something to encourage us to find the flaws and then laugh about how obvious it is that there's this mistake and then to fix it. Because if you're afraid of the pain of finding a flaw, you tend to not want to look for it. And I think God made us that way on purpose.
Well, David, you just released the final episode of your audio podcast, so congrats on that. As this episode comes out, it just came, your 25th and final episode came out. What's next for this story? Is it going to be taking other formats?
Yeah, we're still exploring the different ways that we'll want to have either a physical or ebook version of this. We will do something. I will probably just have an episode on my podcast of the final thing and announcing how we'll do it. But until then, you can listen to the audio book, which is you get to hear me do a bunch of funny voices. I do all the voice acting, despite what all the outros say. That there are lots of reoccurring jokes, and there are a lot of them in the various outros. But But yeah, you can listen to it. I'm sure links will be spread out, or if you don't want to look up a link, just look up Pilgrim's Progress Reloaded or davidumstattd.com. You'll have to know how to spell Umstattd, and good luck with that. We don't even know, which is why it's misspelled. Literally, it's misspelled German.
Oh, gosh. And, when you arrived in our studio, you came in a nautical airship, a dirigible. So why did you arrive in that? Like, what's something you're working on kind of in the further future?
Well, one of my favorite things in the world is the genre that I call musket punk, which is a genre basically that covers an era that modern fiction, for whatever reason, does not find interesting and that I find fascinating. And that is specifically the era from 1492 to 1836. So that's pre-Victorian, pre-revolver, but post-medieval. So it's musketeers and ninjas and pioneers and pirates. And it's a really cool era, and very little fantasy or steampunk style retro futuristic stuff is done in that era. Nobody knows how to make muskets interesting. I think the limitations of the era are very, very interesting. And the era is when history sort of gained a direction and stopped being cyclical. And so much of where we are now is because of revolutions in mindset and battles and ideologies that happened in that era. And I find it really interesting. And one of the things they were obsessed with was flight. And so it was like, well, what did they think the future of air travel would be like? And it's dirigibles and gliders and dragon riding and those kinds of things. And it is ne'er an airplane to be found, because that's modern. And that's a thing I'm toying around with. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to revise my statement at the beginning, saying I'd like to have a mech. I think I'd much rather have a dragon, because a dragon cannot have its catalytic converter stolen in the middle of the night. They would just burn up the thief with fire. And anyway, that's for another topic. Well, David, thank you so much for joining us today. I can't wait to see what happens next with this story and see some of your musket punk stories in the future. Those sound fascinating. Thank you for joining us today on Fantastical Truth.
Thank you.
Well, Stephen, I love the point you made about how even in our churches, we need a little bit of satire, gentle roasting, laughing at ourselves. I've mentioned my pastor, John Dansby, before, that I really connect to, because we both love science fiction and fantastical stories. And he definitely has that type of sense of humor. When we were first getting involved in this church and going through a partnership class, one of the questions we had was this emphasis that our church has, which is more reformed, about God's sovereignty and salvation. And there was a part in there about, you agree to not teach against this doctrine in our church. And I said, well, okay, I sort of sit the fence with some of this Arminian Calvinist stuff, but I definitely believe in God's election and everything. But how free will enters in, I don't know. So what does that look like to teach against it? And I said, for example, I like to share my faith using something called the 4 spiritual laws, or knowing God personally. And at the very end, it says, it kind of outlines that God created us and loves us. Our sin separates us. Jesus paid the price for our sin and makes a way. But then the 4th point is, you have to individually accept Christ as your Savior. It's not enough just to know this. You have to take action, as we were saying with David. And I said, so does this 4th part of the 4 spiritual laws, does this contradict our church's teaching? How would you phrase that differently? And John said, well, from a reform perspective, I would say, if you are one of the elect, you will accept Christ. and he paused, and I'm like, are you serious? And he just started laughing. I'm like, okay.
Yeah, I'm laughing. Yeah, no, that's not what we would say. I have no issue whatsoever with that 4th spiritual law. Absolutely. Even the good reformed soteriology, the salvation doctrine, would call for an individual response. You're not just fated to do it. You're going to do it, and you need to take action, even if you're predestined to take action. That's another show, though. Yeah.
Yeah. I just love that he could even roast himself a little bit there and just kind of lighten the mood a little bit, because we are talking about really heavy things. So you have to kind of take the temperature down a little bit. And I was like, okay, I know this is the place for me, because this is a church that wrestles with these issues, but it is still loving and gracious. So it's like, as David said, we're adding in the other virtues of love with truth and all those things. So Really enjoyed that discussion today.
Exactly. That's difficult to get right, whether it's a local church or a Christian-made creative allegorical satire. But we should strive to get that right anyway. I just recently, Zach, last month I started a Sunday school at my church, which is actually a 12-part tour through the first 11 chapters of Genesis called "Only the Beginning." And just the past Sunday, our usual pastor had to do a guest pastor spot, and so my Sunday school class got an upgrade. Surprise! I guess technically that means I just preached, but I don't know whether that's it. But the point is, I would not want to do anything like that if I knew it wasn't in a safe place to take some praise and constructive criticism and even a little roasting. I mean, it went really well by all accounts. But if it went too well, I'd start to get intimidated. And I think that's a healthy place to be. Like, I want the roasting, I want to get better, and I want not to go on so long the next time, which apparently did happen, even though I was sure I was watching the clock. But anyway, back in Lorehaven land, we have a mission update from Lorehaven.com. We had our last week's podcast episode 150, Is the U.S. government covering up spy balloons or alien spaceships, with James R. Hannibal. Make sure you don't miss that one. It's part of our Armies of the Aliens series on Fantastical Truth. Last week, by seeming coincidence, we also reviewed James Hannibal's new book, Bear Night, also sponsored at the top of this show. So you can see our review there. All these links in the show notes. This week, by the way, Zach, I just finished the apparently, sad face, very last novel by Frank Peretti. It didn't just come out. It came out in 2012, 11 years ago this month. And you, gentle reader, may have missed it. I certainly missed it, even though I'm a huge Peretti fanboy. I think the premise just seemed a little weird. It was called Illusion, and I wasn't expecting angels and demons, but I was expecting something a little more spiritual. By the way, we are starting up a new and very serious podcast series here on Fantastical Truth that I'll preview in just a moment. Stand by for that. We've been hinting at it. Meanwhile, join Lorehaven.com, sign up for email updates, and you can get all of our news stories and article updates, any of the reviews and podcast episodes, any or all of those that you want delivered to your inbox, as well as exclusive access to the Lorehaven Guild, our Discord community. We're not only starting a new book quest next March for Charles Williams' classic novel War in Heaven, led by book quest guide Elijah David, but we're also talking about everything that we share at Lorehaven, as well as news of interest to fans, such as this whole deal, I think it's a bluff personally, about how we're supposedly going to get more Middle-earth movies, more like the Lord of the Rings trilogy, involving Peter Jackson, Fran Walsh, and Philippa Boyens, the Jackson 3, who helped give us the Lord of the Rings films and the more mixed response Hobbit films. So I don't think it's actually happening. I think it's the company trying to build up worth before a big sale, but talk about that, share your opinion there in the Lorehaven Guild.
And you can also send us a note to podcast@lorehaven.com to give us your thoughts about debating theology, satire, allegory, topics we've discussed today, or other topics we've covered. And Stephen, we got something really special in the comm station that someone sent to our email. It is a voice memo sent all the way from New Zealand, and it's from a gentleman named David Mock.
And he does.
He gives us a gentle roast, which is perfect. It's very much on brand for today's episode. But he was responding to our episode 149, Why Do Christian Fiction Fans Love So Much Romance? And, this is not necessarily our favorite genre for Stephen and I, but we tried to give it a fair hearing. But there were apparently something that we left out of our discussion. So let's hear from David.
I cannot believe you left the theological impact of romance to the final tagline. So it was just the fact that the Bible story is a romance. Yes, there are action stories within. Yes, there is this triumphant, victorious king, the Christ. But he's coming to rescue his bride, the church. And what do romance stories tell us about except that very truth? We need romance books filling our bookshelves so that we have more complex reflections of that one great truth of God's love for us.
Okay, so that was a totally fair point that David made. So thank you so much for sending that to us, David. Yes, the Bible is definitely a romance story in that sense, and it's very central to its theme. And maybe this is a upcoming Fiction's Chief End episode of Why Do Christians Need Romance? Maybe that's something we can do in the future. Let us know if that's to our listeners, if that's something you would like us to cover at some point, like we've done Why Do Christians Need Fantasy or even Horror? So let us know if you agree with David or if you have some other thoughts about that episode. Stephen, what do you think about what David had to say?
I agree, disagree, because I'm going to be all nuanced and stuff. I think it matters whether the word romance in describing the Bible is a noun or an adjective. I mentioned some of this in episode 149. There's some space opera, for example, you'd call it a sci-fi romance. And at that point, sci-fi is the adjective and romance is the noun. So the focus is on the noun, and that's where you would put it on the bookshelf in the bookstore. Or maybe you have a romantic fantasy. I would hear that phrase and think, okay, this is a fantasy primarily, but the romance is the modifier. You'd put it in the fantasy shelf, but there's also some romance going on. The novel I mentioned earlier, Illusion by Frank Peretti, it is a romantic supernatural thriller.
Okay.
Definitely, you get the idea from the cover. There's going to be some romance in there in the back cover, but and it is a beautiful love story. And I wish I'd mentioned it in our last episode. I love it because it actually does that which I asked for in the previous episode. I just started reading it at the time of recording, where I said, I want more romance stories that are set among people who've been married for a long time. And that is exactly what Peretti does. But he's able to get away with it because he does some wibbly wobbly, timey wimey and brings forward the younger version of a man's dearly departed wife who's now dead. But then her younger version arrives, and what's going on here? Peretti does some wibbly wobbly stuff to get around that. I would categorize that as a romantic supernatural thriller, as opposed to a supernatural romance.
So is that what you think the Bible is? That it's a romantic fantasy, romantic supernatural thriller? Romance is the ingredient. It's not the primary genre?
I think it's a romantic supernatural thriller, certainly starring Christ as the hero. But I think really that comes down to theology, doesn't it? Is the point of the Bible, the point of that epic true life adventure that we're in, God's glory and our good, or is it the point, the romance itself? I think if we liken that too much, then we may end up overemphasizing the romance and the feelings and things. But nor would I want to discount those either. I think I would just describe romantic as an adjective describing the genre that the Bible is in, which is, of course, history, running right up to the present and moving into the future. But it's romantic, it's fantastical. Really, the noun there is just gospel. It's its own genre, but there's all kinds of other genres that function as modifiers, except for science fiction, unless you put that into the book of Revelation, as some Christians are wont to do. Next on Fantastical Truth, I mentioned this earlier, the serious mini-series that we're going to do, and that starts with our very next episode. We are planning to explore some perilous territory, starting with one challenge that afflicts many Christian fantastical fans, something we've been talking about behind the scenes on Team Lorehaven. From legalism to worse attacks on God's image in us, many Christian fans have suffered what can only be described as church trauma. How can we show Christ's love to churches that have hurt us, while, more importantly, we heal from these attacks that may come from spiritual family members, the church back home, or other bullies we might encounter who slander us because of our faith or even because of the fantastical stories we enjoy? In our next episode, we begin a new 4-part serious series called Fantastical Foes. Meanwhile, maybe you felt a little light roast today. Maybe you felt the sting of allegory, some stigma attached to that. Isn't this kind of unsubtle? Isn't the satire kind of unserious? Well, yes and yes, but it is helpful to learn to laugh at oneself. I'm still practicing that. You're still practicing that. But I think it is a spiritual virtue to laugh at ourselves, never laugh at virtue itself, take Christ seriously, but see our flaws in light of his perfect righteousness as we continue to seek and find his fantastical truth.